Hello, my name is Jennifer Huddleston, and I'm a Senior Fellow in Technology Policy at the Cato Institute. Welcome to today's Policy Forum on misinformation. What is it, and what should we do about it? I'm excited to have you joining us online, as well as to be moderating a conversation between a fantastic panel of experts on what certainly is a pertinent issue these days. Just this week, we saw a conversation around a video involving bunnies jumping on a trampoline and questions around what might deepfakes or mis and disinformation look like in the digital age. On a more serious note, there's been conversations around how do we improve and media literacy, and what do policy questions look like, particularly in an AI era. Misinformation has been seen as a widespread and serious concern, but nearly every issue that we face involves claims of misinformation as well as disinformation or otherwise misleading content. Despite being frequently framed as an existential threat, misinformation remains hard to define and measure. So, today we will discuss what exactly is misinformation, whether the concerns around this type of content are legitimate, or if they're merely a reflection of panics over new or existing technologies, and what solutions might look like for both policymakers, technology companies, and individual users. As I mentioned, I'm joined today by a panel of experts on this topic, starting with my Cato colleague, David Ansara, who's a fellow for free expression and technology at the Cato Institute. His research focuses on the importance of both policies and cultures that promote free expression. He recently published a new study on the misleading panic over misinformation that is available on Cato's website and will serve largely as the kind of impetus for today's conversation. I'm also joined today by Renee DiResta, a prominent researcher and writer specializing in online manipulation, disinformation, and the dynamics of digital propaganda. She is an associate research professor at Georgetown University McCourt School of Public Policy and the author of Invisible Rulers: The People Who Turn Lies into Reality. And by Jakob Mishangama, who is the founder and executive director of the Future of Free Speech, a research professor at Vanderbilt University, and a senior fellow at the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression. Thank you all for joining me today. For our listeners online, I do want to mention that we will be taking audience questions at the end. We had some excellent questions come in advance, but for those of you tuning in live, you can submit your questions via the webpage, Facebook, YouTube, and X. So starting off, David, as I mentioned, your paper is largely kind of serving as an impetus and a framework for our discussion of this event. Can you tell us a little bit about the key takeaways of your recent paper on this issue, and what does it add to this ongoing debate about mis and disinfo online?
Yeah, so I wanted to write this paper because over the past few years, I'd seen a lot of alarmist statements about misinformation and disinformation, whether it was elections, COVID, various other social political issues. It just always seemed like misinformation was a little bit like the boogeyman. It was always around the corner and causing some sort of harm that we needed to be worried about. The World Economic Forum does a regular risk report, and it features hundreds of experts from around the world. And last year, they found that AI-powered misinformation was the greatest threat facing our civilization currently. Not wars or threats of wars by nuclear armed powers, not inflation or the economy, not climate change. It was misinformation. So I really wanted to get to the bottom of what was going on here. And so to do that, I decided to start at the beginning. What is misinformation? It's a perennial question. Everyone asks it, experts and average people alike. And the emergent consensus is that misinformation is false and misleading information that's shared by people who believe it's true. They don't know that it's false. And this differs from disinformation, which tends to be information that is shared for the purpose of purposely misleading and harming people. I'll generally use misinformation as a catch-all, but there's a variety of terms around this issue. And so the problem with this definition is that by including the idea of misleading information, it dramatically expands the scope of content that we could talk about. There's lots of things in our world that are provably false, provably true, But then so many things fit in between. They're not true or false. It might be the way we frame an issue, the sources and citations that we use in a news article. It might be our political preferences, our opinions. It might be the way that we use humor or satire or parody. It could be a variety of ways that news organizations choose certain sources, choose certain people to interview versus others. All these and others are ways that which we communicate with people, but we might mislead someone else. The example I like to use is that of the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal. They might approach the same news story and have different sources, cites different statistics, talk to different experts, frame the story differently, and they may even suggest that a certain policy is better in this case or another. People might read those news stories and come away with with different accounts of what's the problem, what we should do about it, and they might find both of them or neither of them to be misleading. So is that misinformation? Well, per the definition, it sort of seems like it fits, but that can't be. That's wrong. It's unhelpful. And what it seems to be is that when we include misleadingness in the definition of misinformation, it becomes a very subjective topic, something that is harder to study and very hard to write good public policy to address. In fact, it's often then used as sort of a political cudgel against speech that politicians don't like. But despite the fact that the definition is subjective, maybe there's a problem here. Maybe there still is a harm that we need to be addressing. And so I want to look at the academic research and say, like, what is the impact of misinformation? And it turns out it's complex and maybe not as severe as the sort of existential claims make it sound like. And so there's a few narratives around misinformation that I want to rectify in my paper. The first is the idea that misinformation is everywhere and it's sort of uniquely ubiquitous on the internet. It's certainly true that there's lots of misinformation on the internet. It's certainly true that you can find it, but there was plenty of false and misleading information before the internet. We talk about things like witch hunts and snake oil salesmen. These are terms that all predate the internet and refer to the fact that there is false information. People had lots of false beliefs before the advent of the internet. Now it's just very easy to measure and find misinformation because it's all in one place. It's all on the internet. And so I think we sometimes get caught up into believing that misinformation is uniquely ubiquitous online, where I think it's always been with us. Similarly, there's an idea that misinformation spreads like a virus, that it's just something you see it and you have no choice but to accept it. People are just they're overcome by misinformation when they see it. But the research seems to suggest that people respond in a complex series of ways. They may fact check, they may do their own research. Users may share it with parody or humor or satire. People may do the whole, interesting if true kind of statement where I don't know what that means. They're sort of on the fence about it. Other people may believe it. They may share it to show that they're part of a group. They want to show that they're in with the right crowd. The point is that people respond in complex ways, and I think the framing of misinformation as a virus is not really the right analogy. And a final narrative that we see is that misinformation causes large swaths of people to change their beliefs and behavior. And this is the real harm of misinformation. It's if misinformation can cause people to hold or do harmful things, then that's bad. But in reality, the research shows that it's hard to show a causal link between what misinformation and directly holding or doing harmful things. The people who most often believe misinformation are those people who are predisposed to believe it. If they see misinformation which confirms their biases, and they just sort of accept it, it's so-called too good to check. They accept it without doing further investigation when they should. And this is similar for how behavior works. People act on things because, this this confirms my prior ways of my prior beliefs in the way I was acting. A good example of this is maybe the 2016 election with Russian disinformation that was shared in an attempt to sow chaos and help Donald Trump get elected. This information was largely shared among people who were highly partisan, pro-Trump, anti-Hillary Clinton voters. Those people already really wanted to vote for Trump, really didn't want to vote for Hillary Clinton. And so if they saw disinformation that was a lie about Hillary Clinton, it wasn't fundamentally changing their behavior. It was just confirming their already existing biases and preferences because they were already highly partisan actors who wanted to believe one thing or another. And so overall, I don't think misinformation is as impactful as it's been made out to be, but still we face what some have called a panic, including myself. And for this analogy, I actually turned to Jakob's book on the history of free speech, which is I think a powerful account about how we've seen a conflict among different types of speech throughout our history, starting with all the way back Athens and Rome. We have a more egalitarian system of speech. Every citizen has the right to speak in the assembly, versus a more elitist conception of speech that you see in Rome, more senatorial in nature. And we see this sort of elitist versus egalitarian struggle continue throughout history, whether it be the Reformation versus the church, the science versus religion, Enlightenment versus the nobility, the way that the printing press is spreading new ideas on all these topics. And then whatever power is in place is immediately trying to control and censor the printing press. And then this continues again, the telegraph, the radio, the TV. And I think it continues into the present in the way that governments try to censor and regulate online speech. And how I think too many, I think, journalists and academics and tech companies have probably been a bit too quick to suppress or denounce supposed misinformation, because I feel like there's a bit of a sense of there's a try to put the genie back in the bottle and try to control speech, but I don't think that's really helped us build trust. And we see right now our institutions face real record low trusts. Um, and I think many Americans have recoiled when there have been significant high profile failures of our institutions. Experts and elites in our institutions play an important role in developing knowledge. They have expertise which we should avail ourselves of, but different sides of our society are simply talking past each other, and we don't trust our institutions anymore to help us sort through these different truth claims. So then that's the problem, and there's no real easy answer or silver bullet. But the way I look at it is we need to reaffirm our commitment to what is called liberal inquiry. Jonathan Rauch put out a book, Kindly Inquisitors, in 1993, way ahead of its time, but where he identifies the sense of liberal order, the way that a liberal society figures out what is true and what is false and works through it. And he says that first, no one gets a final say, and no one has personal authority. And it's this idea of debate, constant iteration, and challenge from people on different sides of an issue, that this is the best tool that liberal societies have created for generating knowledge. So my paper ultimately ends with a series of recommendations for tech companies and policymakers for how we put this principle into practice. I'm sure we'll get into this more as the event goes on, but the key principles are that we need to be more trusting of Americans with more speech. We need to trust them with their speech. We need to be, I think, restricting the government's role there, and we should be building more deliberative bottom-up ways of developing knowledge and countering misinformation. I think that modern technology means we're going to hear from a lot more voices, and and a lot more perspectives, and it's going to take us time to get over, I think, this very disruptive new technology, but we're all going to be better off for it in the long run. So that's the gist of what my paper is about, and I look forward to discussing it with this great group.
Thank you so much for that overview. And in the spirit of hearing from more voices, I want to bring in our other two experts on the panel here. Jakob and Renee, you are both experts in online speech and have done a great deal of work on this topic, some of which David just referenced in this conversation and references in his paper. To start with you, Renee, was there anything about this paper that particularly resonated with you, or was there anything that you disagreed with?
Yeah, so let me go through. I think there were 3 points that David outlined in key findings that I'll just touch on. The first was the sort of misinformation is poorly defined. I appreciated the chart showing the different definitions that vary across governments. It reminded me of the EU definitions of chocolate, right? I don't think we're ever going to see harmonization across tech policy vocabulary. But I also think that the drive to lock down a single definition sometimes it introduces analysis paralysis also, where the term becomes the thing that we debate rather than working to develop an understanding of what drives belief formation and narrative spread today, which I think is actually the thing that we're really getting at here. So I've argued for a while now, and I think David, maybe you'd agree that we are using the term too broadly. That is something that, at SIO we actually never saw ourselves as researching misinformation. We saw ourselves as looking at viral rumors and a form of propaganda that is unique to social media because the audience participates very directly, which means that it deeply resonates with community identity or with senses of grievance or with beliefs that they invest in through the act of participating themselves. One example might be they're eating the pets. Nobody was eating the pets in Springfield, but hearing that nobody was eating the pets, which was an objectively false claim, so it quite neatly falls under misinformation, but it wasn't misinformation because the true or falsity of the claim was never the point, right? The bigger story was the point. The propaganda narrative about who is America for, who is Springfield for, was the point. But yet, you could define that as misinformation if you wanted to, the same way you could say that the 2020 election was stolen is misinformation. And yet again, I think the risk, though, is that we torture ourselves with the term, particularly terms like malinformation, which confuses maybe more than it clarifies. So I do agree on that front. But then we get to the question of um, quibbling about volume, I think, where it is true. And, I've read those papers by like Sasha Altay and Hugo Mercier and a few of the others, where it is true that it is an objectively small share of total content. But I think that when we look at volume as the metric, a single post can, in fact, reshape a national conversation if it hits at the right moment, or if the meme is right, or if it hits the right network, which is why I think that focusing on that particular aspect of it, moving into the harms analysis is, I think, the right place to be. And I have appreciated that the research community went in that direction as opposed to focusing on volume. I think that was the right direction for it to go. So the older papers, I think, moved, right? Anti-vax sentiment was once marginal until it wasn't, and kids started dying of measles in Texas. QAnon was very small until all of a sudden it wasn't. So I think having that conceptualization, again, of it as belief formation, like that is kind of the important thing. And that's where I think when we talk about harms, that need to update mental models and to say, like, people aren't going to fake news sites anymore. Fake news in 2016 and what we're talking about in 2025, where it's much more like identity based influencers, what you're talking about with like people see a thing and then change their mind, that was called like the hypodermic model theory. That was actually like people stopped believing in that in academia in 1947. It was this idea that you were persuaded by who was around you. And that's what I think is really interesting about social media. Like, who is around you? You're surrounded by elites, by influencers, and by other people. And like that belief formation model, I think, is what's really interesting. And then the one thing, I think the area where we disagree is your prescription around defunding. And I want to just say that I've only ever gotten one NSF grant in my life. So, so I feel like it's going to be read as like me, defending my turf here, but it's not. And what I want to talk about actually is the source that you cited for this, the $267 million in spend, was this right-wing org called Open the Books. And the reason I want to touch on this one specifically is because I think, and this is not to pick on you specifically, it's the propaganda that goes along with this narrative about defunding as being the thing that works. Because the $267 million in misinformation research, $127 million of that was in 2021. So over almost half of that was in 2021. $80 million of that, $80 million of that 1 year was to build a network to create distribution mechanisms for information about the COVID vaccine and flu vaccines. So 80 million of that 267 million was one project. And I think that we actually need to be funding that kind of stuff because that's not censorship. That's creating counter speech infrastructure. And the methodology of groups like Open the Books is to search for the word misinformation and to say, look at this egregiously high number, we need to defund it. And I think that that itself is just like, it's the wrong way to think about it, to do these like these sort of blanket prescriptions that like the government shouldn't be involved. I think creating institutional resilience and counter speech infrastructure, that modernizing institutions to participate in belief formation by participating in modern speech infrastructure is absolutely the business of government. So I totally disagree with that particular prescription, not because I think that I need to have that grant funding, but because I think that it actually really does matter. And so my frustration with some of where this conversation has gone in the public sphere has been that by looking at things like the conversations around the GAC or the DHS or the censorship industrial complex hoax or the Murthy v. Missouri case, a lot of that stuff has reframed the conversation where the moral panic is not about misinformation, it's about content moderation or the reframing of any sort of reaction to what is happening as some sort of like cabal or some sort of overreach, when in actuality, Private companies responding in certain ways is completely appropriate. And I think even government funding certain types of responses, like $80 million for information distribution, is a completely worthwhile form of government funding. So I think that my response would be, I do very strongly resonate with your points about how Americans should renew their belief in free expression, that we should have the ability to debate hard topics, to counter bad speech. I think that we just need to recognize that the ability to do it in this environment, on this infrastructure, is not as easy as it once was, in part because of the complexity of attention capture and the challenges of deeply fragmented information environments. I feel like I've probably hit my 7 minutes here. So I'll turn it over to Jakob. Maybe
Yeah,
he'll have
thank
more to
you.
say on that.
Jakob, same question to you. What particularly resonated with you in this paper, and was there anything that you would potentially disagree with?
No, I well, first of all, thanks for inviting me and to be on this panel. I largely agree with the paper, not only because David extensively quoted from my book, but I thought it was refreshing to see this combination of challenging some of the dominant narratives, because I think Renee is probably right in saying that academia may have moved beyond some of the dominant narratives, but policymakers certainly have not. And so I do think that the mis and disinformation debate is very much caught up in the sort of elitist egalitarian clash of conceptions of free speech. The problem, I think, is, I mean, history rhymes rather than repeats itself. So there are obviously very huge differences between the information environment that confronted the ancient Athenians and the one that confronts us now, right? So it is certainly easier, as Renee also shows in her book, to, if you want to find validation for your beliefs. And as you know, the research that you point to, David, shows that the people who are most likely to believe, share, and engage with disinformation, however you want to define it, are people who are sort of hyper partisans or strongly believe in one set of ideological concepts. And so it's much easier for those people to engage and find that kind of information in ways that might have been more difficult before. And that, so that is a potential vector for harms, but but I also think it's important not to sort of romanticize the past, right? So this sort of the example that is often used is the days of Walter Cronkite, where he served up the truth, and everyone believed had sort of the same beliefs more or less. That I think is wrong in many ways. First of all, if you were to look at how, let's say, how newspapers would cover debates around civil rights, if you were to look at newspapers here in Tennessee and newspapers in New York, they would probably have very, very different takes on it. But it's also true that when you look at sort of national news, there would just be perspectives that were not included, and you would take something as gospel that was one particular view, but that did not necessarily reflect a lot of differing viewpoints. I think my favorite example is in 1961 in France. There was a protest by Algerians. At the time, Algerians were not allowed. They were basically under a curfew in France because France was fighting a war in Algeria, and Algerians in France were fighting back with terrorist attacks. And so these Algerians who were peaceful protesters were met with brutal repression by the government. Lots of people were died. They were thrown into the Seine in Paris. But in mainstream media, there was very little coverage of this. there was an official cover-up on the part of the French government. It didn't allow access to archives. And if you read the New York Times coverage at the same time, it repeated some of the propaganda of the French government. And you really have to get into 1999 before there was an official recognition by the French state that a massacre had happened. And you have to go to something like 2021 before a French president apologized about this. Now, imagine a brutal crackdown in one of the largest cities in the Western world happening today, where everyone would have had, mobile phones. They would be able to live stream it. You couldn't hide that in the same way that you could hide a massacre in 1961. And journalists in mainstream media would have a lot more sources to cover that would challenge these lies, frankly, on behalf of the French government. So I think that's a good example of how we sometimes romanticize the past. So yes, we have this fragmented ecosystem of information and ideas allows us to self-select, and that is likely, that can lead to serious harms. January 6th in the U.S., January 8th in Brazil. I think that it's very difficult to imagine those events taking place without the fragmented ecosystem of information that we inhabit today. Ultimately, though, I think that the benefits of a more diverse ecosystem of information and ideas outweigh the potential harms and the real harms. But I think that we have a tendency to focus incessantly on the dark sides, and this is what you reference in your paper, David, when you look at how the World Economic Forum is talking about this, about when you look at how the European Commission is looking at this. And you unfortunately also see it in government responses. So you see, actually, if you look at laws around mis and disinformation, you see a huge uptick in laws banning various categories of false information from around 2016. So it begins with a response to the US presidential election and this idea that it was swayed by Russian disinformation. Then it gets a huge uptick around COVID. And it never really recedes back to the pre-2015, 2016 level. And you also see it in the number of arrests of journalists, for instance. And unfortunately, this is a gift to more authoritarian states who can say, well, the European Union is banning state-sponsored Russian media outlets. They're even telling social media companies and search companies to ban the sharing of Russian state-sponsored media outlets. And so we'll do the same. And so I think that the collateral damage to free speech, based on the sort of the wider global concerns about mis and disinformation, have actually been very, very substantial. I just came back from Brazil a couple of weeks ago, which is, of course, very relevant to what's going on in the US, because the Trump administration is cracking down on Brazil. Now, that is deeply hypocritical given the ways that the current administration is restricting free speech itself, including what it defines as disinformation and so on. But I think Brazil is a democracy which really showcases how dangerous it is to allow, in this case, the judiciary to police truth, which has, I think, increased polarization and really put free speech under pressure. And I'm being told to wrap up, so I'll do that, but look forward to the rest of the conversation.
Thank you, Jakob. And we have quite a bit of conversation, including some conversation, I'm sure, around some of the recent events you mentioned. David, before I move on to my questions for the panel as a whole and some of the audience questions we've got in, I want to ask if you want to take a few minutes to respond to anything that either Renee or Jakob have said.
Sure, yeah. So just a couple points. First, I'll just start with Jakob's point about, yeah, I recently wrote a blog about Brazil and noted the same thing. It's like really hard to be like, Brazilian authorities, please stop engaging in vast overreach and sort of in your desire to protect democracy and saying we need to clamp down on all sorts of misinformation and things that they view as harmful. And at the same time, the Trump administration is doing whatever it wants with CBS and various academic institutions. It is puts us in America in a much weaker position to be able to call out that kind of bad behavior when we are engaging in something of the same kind here at home. From Renee's points, I would say I agree that for instance, private researchers, private institutions should be able to research whatever they want. So I know that's been a conflation you talked about, and I'm having someone who was worked in Meta previously to coming to Cato. I get the distinction between, many people don't, between content moderation and government censorship, and there's a lot of different things we can do in content moderation, ranging from removing all the way to just informing. And I always tend to prefer things that are more informative or reduction as opposed to removing. But yeah, has been a conflation there, and so I think it is worth that as an important thing that I know you always bring up. And it is an important thing that you bring up, the distinction between censorship and content moderation. Um, but the area where we disagree on government funding, I agree. This is one where, yeah, like who is the best person to create those establishments, these parts of society that are going to create opportunities for discussion and debate, and that's where I know some of the examples that have been out there in the press and elsewhere are things where it's like I get why Americans would be frustrated if they saw their tax dollars were going to the one example that I always like is the one from Medan, which is Medan says that they were trying to counter fear mongering and anti-black narratives, undermining trust in the mainstream media, glorifying vigilantism, weakening political participation. Those were the misinformation narratives that they were trying to counter. And even if it was with more speech, great, it just felt a little bit like the government is giving money to those people to engage in what seems like somewhat politically like favoring one side of a misinformation debate over another side. And so that kind of thing, I think, detracts from real good work that could happen if there wasn't government money behind it. Because I think the government money sort of gives this perspective of people feeling like, well, now you are starting to get into censorship. Like my money is being used to at least make my viewpoint look bad. You're at least saying that I'm a spreader of misinformation, as opposed to just like using the bully pulpit, which is fine, or researchers doing it on their own. But when their tax dollars are being used for it, I understand that sort of that response that people might have, and that's why I think it maybe undermines the initiative. But anyway, I know we have more questions, so I would love to get into those.
Thanks. And to kind of start off, I want to go to something that David comes up a good bit in your paper and came up a bit in your opening statements, and something I know Jakob and Renee, you've both have thought about a bit, which is this question of is mis or disinformation really a new problem? If you look at the popular media, it would seem like this just came about with social media, and now with AI, it's gasoline on a fire or something along those lines. But I think for a lot of us, we can think of historical examples, whether it's the question of the infamous War of the Worlds broadcast where individuals thought that the aliens were actually invading, or whether it's things like, if we look at the turn of the 20th century, calls to ban or regulate what were literal photoshops, where you would take this new invention of the camera or the photograph and have it changed around, and fears of what that could do to the political discourse, or how that could in DC make people look like they were standing with famous elected officials, and maybe those elected officials did or didn't want to be in those photos. So, to all of our panel, are there current elements of the technology that you think make this issue more or less concerning? Are there any ways that our technological age may also be benefiting our ability to respond to mis and disinformation? And if you could speak a little bit to kind of the question of, is this or is this not a new problem?
Yeah, so I'll just start to say that I want to give some examples of ways in which I think it's similar, and then at the end I'll discuss I think an important, I think, distinction. Um, I think that there's always been, and through history, there's always been some sort of the fears of new technologies causing misinformation and social breakdown. Some examples are like Pope Innocent VIII in 1487 said they needed to regulate the printing press to stop the misuse of it for, quote, distributing pernicious writings. In 1515, next Pope says that you need to printers can't publish at all unless they have prior approval, because once again, the same concern. English royal historians look back and say that it was the bullets of the press and the scandalous and calumniating ink of King Charles's opponents that led his misguided people, quote, to be persuaded to a horrid rebellion, that is the English Civil War. You see Ben Franklin arguing about that legislators need special privileges and that they should restrict the press, including the pamphlets, which were so commonly used against the British, but were also used against colonial legislatures and various colonial figures they wanted to pillory. But because he said we needed, Ben Franklin even said because we needed to preserve, quote, authority and decency. The New York Times talked about the telegraph being superficial, sudden, unsifted, too fast for the truth. It also printed things against the telegraph, the phonograph. We were worried about radio and propaganda at the turn of the 20th century. Um, it, I think it comes down to that the in general, technologies they're neutral. They're the same. Human nature is at work in all of them. There's opportunities for more good speech and opportunities for more bad speech. And it comes down to how we use the technologies and also how innovative the technologies are in creating useful tools. And that's actually where my greatest concern with the most recent technologies are. It's just that I think they're new. We're in a period where it took us centuries as a society to really get a handle on how we use the printing press and how we accept the fact that we like this idea that people are spreading speech. And even then, we're still struggling with it today. And so I think the challenge maybe is that it is the newest thing, and this is a disruptive period. And I don't think it's surprising in that sense that we're grappling with it as much as we are, because we're like in the first. It's only been 30 years or so since the sort of modern internet, and so that doesn't surprise me as what's going on today.
Jakob or Renee, any other thoughts on the kind of historical context of this issue?
Yeah, no,
Well,
go ahead, Renee.
I was going to say after the printing press was the 30 Years' War. With AI, so at Stanford Internet Observatory, like we didn't study misinformation, we studied adversarial abuse. So we did look at specifically how things are abused intentionally. I think the focus here is misinformation, so the intent is not to derail, but we're entering kind of a golden age of scams right now. And one of the things that's kind of remarkable is with things like Nudify apps and voice cloning and the ability to create both unreality and the sort of corollary to that is the ability to deny reality. The difference with Photoshop is you were sort of editing something that existed. There was at least a basis in reality. Even occasionally you would have a very highly sophisticated clone, but it required a very high degree of technique in order to accomplish it. So a lot of the time, what is different is the scale and the speed, and then who has access and what can be done with it. And again, per my comment early on about the kind of quantity is not always the problem. In this particular case, I think the quantity becomes the problem. This is the sort of phenomenon of like slop and things like this. One of the things that we see is it's not only celebrities and politicians, it really begins to impact ordinary people in very unexpected ways. You have eighth graders in middle school whose classmates undress them, put them up on the internet, and that's out there forever. So there are unintended consequences that are happening as a result of this, and policymakers don't quite know what to do with it. We're looking to try to, I think the Take It Down Act, I know that was very heavily criticized as far as the notice and takedown requirements, but I think that some of what is happening is attempts to take laws and make them apply to new technologies. They don't always do it well. There's some sort of shoehorning and attempts to punish the outcome as opposed to the technology itself. I think that is the right approach. But I think we're also being naive if we say that the technology is not materially transformative in unintended and occasionally harmful ways.
Jakob, anything to add? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, no, David gave a lot of good examples, some of which are also in my book, and so it's definitely not a new phenomenon. Fears about misinformation or ideas that could undermine what is believed to be ideas, concepts that are absolutely essential for the social cohesion of society. I mean, that is what heresy is essentially about, right? So heresy is an original word for disinformation. So in that sense, it's not new. Again, the context and the specifics change with new technologies, but it's really interesting if you go back to debates in the United Nations right after World War II. So there was this big debate about, when the United Nations was crafting these human rights conventions about free speech and its limits. And the two main topics that they were debating at the time was hate speech and disinformation, exactly the same topics that we're discussing today. And so there were essentially two camps. America was very sort of free speech absolutist, and the Soviet Union and its allies was very, it's like, yeah, free speech is a good idea, but there has to be an obligation to prohibit hate speech and disinformation because that was essentially what brought about World War II. And Eleanor Roosevelt was I think, quite prophetic in saying, if you include an obligation to ban um, certain types of speech, that essentially makes the commitment to free speech meaningless and will be exploited by totalitarian states. But what was interesting at the time was that there were some Americans who sort of were in and around these negotiations who were quite critical of the stance of the American administration. So a guy called John B. Whitten, who was like a pioneer in studying the ways that totalitarian regimes had used shortwave radio for propaganda purposes. So essentially, he had built sort of the first the first, you might call, a think tank or institute that studied shortwave propaganda the same way that any respectable university today studies misinformation. And so there's a lot of the same debates around these new technologies that took place when it came to other technologies. One thing, when it comes to AI, I think it's quite interesting to look at sort of the quite, I would say, hysterical warnings around the super election year of 2024, where we were told that democracy would drown in lies and AI generated disinformation. All of the studies that I've seen, at least, have concluded that there was no significant impact on elections. There was lots of deep fakes created, AI played a role, and I think that's very different from sort of the fake news that you're mentioning, Renee. That is sort of very, like, if I took an image of you and turned it into like a nude that's sort of very tangible, aimed at you, but that's very, very different from sort of trying to sway an election through AI. And I think there's sort of a bit of I think, overblown fear of AI's impact on elections, just because as human beings, even if you can make like a perfect video of Donald Trump in a compromising situation or Joe Biden in a compromising situation, we as human beings take a lot of other cues than just the video itself, right? When we evaluate whether this is something that we believe or not. So that's why I am much less fearful of the impact of deepfakes when it comes to elections and politics than some of the breathless warnings that we've seen. And at least so far, I think that has been borne out, but that has not stopped a number of laws and regulatory initiatives that I think generally go way too far in restricting free speech based on pretty poor empirical basis. So that's my fear.
Can I respond to that really quickly?
Yeah.
Yes.
No, we made that point too. I got asked that question. I was like constantly called by media during the last cycle, and I think that they don't understand the threat necessarily. The sensational stuff gets debunked. When it's high profile people, it's immediately sort of assessed by the forensic teams that have the incentive to go and look at it, as opposed to when it is a random person who has no public presence, and that one Google search result is going to be the sort of the X who's decided to go and undertake this sort of revenge porn situation. So that is unfortunately the reality, right? The deepfake video is not as much of a risk to a high profile political person as it is to an ordinary person. The threat model is just very different. I think the one frustration I've had with the AI deepfake and politics conversation has been that the video is not the thing that matters. Audio is actually much more interesting because you don't have the visual cues actually. But the other piece of it is that it is actually almost entirely divided on trust, because the one area where we've seen deepfakes come out that has been significantly political has been around October 7th, where there have been real images released of carnage coming out of real historical kind of atrocities that have come out, where they have been dismissed as deepfakes, but they are in fact real. And that's because the existence of the technology leads to battles about whether it is real or not, based entirely on whether you trust the source. And that's the thing that I think is actually most interesting about it. It's that bifurcation around, like, I can dismiss this because I like the person who's saying it to me, or because I don't like the person who's saying it to me. And it actually doesn't matter anymore whether it's real or not. And that's the thing that I find really interesting. And I think going into 2028 or 2026, as the technology gets better, it is going to be very interesting, I think, to see how that trust component and who distributes it plays much more heavily into how people process it, based on what we saw around, for example, October 7th.
So I do want to ask one more question for the group to make sure that we talk a little bit about, well, what's the response to this conversation before I turn to hopefully some time for at least one or two audience questions. So I guess that in some ways is the question itself. What would you offer to technology platforms, policymakers, or users in terms of suggestions around this question of misinformation and disinformation? Are there any particular best practices or particular things that you would suggest trying to avoid? Jakob, you've been very kind in letting other people go first, so I'll start with you with this one.
Yeah, I think that we're in a phase of modeling through of sort of tweaking and experimenting. So I don't know that we have like a great solution that can just be implemented. Also, I don't think there's a one size fits all. The country level example that I like to use the most is Taiwan. So Taiwan is a very specific case, right? It's a small, very successful democracy, but it is based 100 miles or so from mainland China, which is very open about its ambition to take it over and make it part of China, and subverting it to the Chinese Communist Party. And it faces aggressive cyber threats. It faces aggressive disinformation campaigns, state-sponsored ones. But it has responded quite differently from, say, the European Union by building a sort of organic bottom-up approach towards fighting disinformation that mostly eschews censorship. So they have pioneered crowdsourced real-time fact checking. They have done a lot to create more resilient technological solutions that tap into trust rather than sort of top-down bureaucratic approaches. When they did try to adopt something a bit similar to the Digital Services Act in Europe, it was rejected by the Taiwanese as being too censorial in nature, probably because it was not until 1987 that they became a democracy. So they are quite fearful of that. So I think that's a very inspiring model. Then I think there are various things that you can try when it comes to tech companies. So I was the co-author of a paper on building pro-social media with Glenn Weil and Audrey Tang, who I should say contributed a lot more to the paper than I did. But Audrey Tang, of course, was a minister in Taiwan. Glenn Weil is a economist and technologist, and so that sort of imagines a different type of social media environment, one that that doesn't necessarily optimize for immediate engagement, but also one that tries to optimize for bridging divides or give you pertinent information about, if something is trending, it is people with different perspectives rather than just people who are on the right or the left. I am one of the few people who actually think that community notes is a better alternative to sort of established fact checkers. It might not, in its current model, be the finished article, and I'm sure there are ways to improve it. But I do think that crowdsourced fact checking is a much better way to try and go about this than sort of top-down approaches, and one that can potentially match the accuracy of professional fact checkers, but be a lot more, scalable and also increase trust if done right.
Renee, I'll turn it over to you.
So I have written a lot over the years about the importance of design, and I spend kind of more time on that. I actually work with Glenn and Audrey on a pro-social recommender project. I am a big fan of community notes, including using LLMs to write them. Um, all of that work has to be funded somewhere, so I also support government funding of science research. And on that front, no, I think from a policymaker perspective, for a long time, I've been on the record, I think, as saying that I just don't believe that the US regulates anything. So I just haven't really wasted my time on that front, besides arguing for transparency research, because I think it's very hard to make arguments about social media and its impacts without transparency data. For a long time, we were in this golden age of platforms rather proactively sharing it. X did, Twitter did, Facebook did, that they really sort of walked that back. Funny enough, the way that we get that data now is through the EU DSA, through Article 40. So as much as there are aspects of the DSA I don't like, things like interoperability and the right of users to take their data and move to other platforms, that will come through EU regulation. Transparency and the ability for users to understand what is happening will come through EU regulation. Right to appeal when their content is taken down is guaranteed in the EU and not in the US. So I do think when we think about what does regulation look like, what are ways to provide protections for free expression, and are there mechanisms for doing that? What does that look like? What are ways in which the US can have that, either through interoperability or through transparency? Those are areas where I do think that the US Congress should be looking at guaranteeing that, and I would like to see it. Because I think it's very hard, when David is looking for data to analyze this problem, and we're looking at papers that are going to be increasingly outdated because no one has data access anymore. One of the things that we should be looking at actually is guaranteeing research access in some way.
David, I know you have a section on this in your paper. If you want to kind of outline what some of the potential responses you see are.
Yeah, a good number of them have been covered, so I'll keep it brief. I would say that at a high level, this idea of digital literacy, education, ways in which especially tech companies, I think, can encourage, whether it be pre-bunking, essentially developing critical thinking skills, like people who are going to come across information that's not necessarily about the individual given fact check. It's about how do I want to make sure that people on my platform are thinking critically about the information that they are consuming and they see online, making them better at ferreting it out for themselves. This also looks at, I'm also with Jakob as a fan of community notes, but I think you can also see this in other ways that tech companies can be looking to decentralize, if by giving more authority to users or to other developers who want to develop products, whether that be middleware, whether that be something more like Blue Sky, where you have sort of moderation services that can step in. I think anything that pushes more of that responsibility out to civil society and individuals, that will empower them to make better choices about what content they want to see in their feeds and what they don't want to see, and how that's moderated, and how does the fact check or the note come through, and who do they trust for those notes. All those questions, I think, are ones which a more decentralized model can support. And I think we see, like I said, increasing interest in these kind of more decentralized models. So I'm hopeful to see that going forward. For policymakers themselves, I'll just quickly say that I do think that there's also a question just about specifically about foreign disinformation, and I'll say that this is a place where I do think the U.S. government and governments have a role to play, because there's nefarious actors abroad that are directly trying to influence our elections or our speech or whatnot. But I do think we have to be very careful. And that's the note I'll just note, a note of caution to say that there have been ways in which our intelligence community or our establishments have sometimes looped in American speech things as sort of Russian disinformation. Obviously, people on the right will point to things like the Hunter Biden laptop story, but there are other ways in which we've sometimes gotten things wrong in the name of stopping foreign disinformation, and that, like I said, I think undermines the real important work that should be done to counter truly illicit, truly nefarious plots by foreign actors to try to spread chaos. So I think they should do it, but I think we need to be. I would spread a note of caution on that, making sure we're targeting just the worst bad actors and most nefarious and clearly illicit activities in that space.
This has been a really great conversation. And as I mentioned, we're running short on time, but I do want to make sure that I get at least one of our audience questions in. And I'm going to kind of combine a few of them that came in on a similar topic for the panel, which is this kind of question of much of the attention is focused on the creation of mis or disinformation. Is that where the conversation should be focused? Is this more of a conversation about the amplification or the distribution? And is this something that we should only be focusing on in kind of a tech policy context, or is there also conversations in the more traditional media context as well? So kind of the question of if we are having conversations around mis and disinformation, not only what does that even mean, but where should those questions be focused within our kind of media ecosystem? And David, I'll start with you.
Yeah, so the idea about how we build, for instance, like critical thinking, the way that we develop a culture of people who are not skeptical, because skepticism itself is sometimes linked with people then believing in conspiracy theories and not trusting any source of information. But we want to build a sort of sense of intellectual humility, and that does extend beyond just technology companies and the current issue of online speech. But in general, it's a trait that we need to teach to people, just generally speaking. It doesn't matter whether that's the news you're consuming on your TV or whether that's what you're seeing on YouTube. So I would just quickly note that I do think that there is a commonality of work that needs to be done that isn't necessarily easy. It's not a silver bullet. It doesn't quickly fix the problem, but it does apply across both it apply regardless of where the misinformation pops up.
Renee or Jakob, any further thoughts on this one? All right. Well, with that, before I formally close this out, as I mentioned, we're kind of running a little short on time. I'd like to give each of our panelists kind of a minute or two for any last thoughts, as well as some information on where our attendees can find out more about your work on this topic. So I'll start in kind of reverse order of how we started with our opening statements with Jakob, and then then go to Renee and then David. So Jakob, any last thoughts on this ongoing and interesting conversation, and where can people find out more about your work?
Yeah, disinformation, misinformation is not a problem that can be solved. It's inherent to human nature, to complex societies. Some of the issues will be amplified by technology, but technology can also play a role in mitigating some of the harms, real or perceived. But if policymakers or tech companies tell you that they have a solution to this problem, be very, very fearful. You can find out more about our work at thefutureofreespeech.org, which is the organization that I lead. You can also look at Jay Mshangama, Jay and my last name, on X. Yeah, and thanks for having me.
I would kind of plus one that, but I would say it's also sort of a chronic condition, which means that we've also in prior environments had means of responding to it. We didn't used to treat fact checking as some sort of, cabal of people trying to brainwash you. We acknowledged it for what it was. And I think that fact checking actually works quite nicely alongside community notes, and these things are complementary. As far as where I am, I have Substack. I'm on Blue Sky. I really like Blue Sky for the modular aspect of it, not the lib Twitter aspect of it. So I'm there a lot. I'm on Threads. And I write for Lawfare, so I'm there quite a bit these days too.
Great. And David?
Yeah, so I would just I want to thank everyone for attending the event, and I really want to just, if I had something to communicate, it's the idea that we as humans are biased. We like to believe our prior beliefs, and so that the whole idea of this liberal inquiry means we need to be able to challenge the things that we hold deeply. All of us have this problem. I think our panelists all agreed on that. And so the question is just how do we best address, how do we encourage a society that is questioning but not overly skeptical, and one that is working in a deliberative fashion to find and develop the truth. So I hope my paper contributes to that, and you can find my work and the work of all of our colleagues on cato.org.
Thank you so much. And thank you to our panelists for what was an excellent conversation. And as you can tell, we probably could keep going easily for another hour on this topic, if not more. I also want to thank our audience. We had a lot of great questions come in, and I apologize that we could not get to all of them. A video recording of this event will also be available on Cato's website. Thank you so much for joining us for today's Policy Forum.